Welcome everyone to the sixth and the last event of our Greener Together, a practical guide to low carbon construction, which is part of a bigger project, which is in partnership with the St Albans City Council and the University of Hertfordshire and funded by Innovate UK. The idea of this project is to empower people to make difference through a behavioral change. I'm organizing this and coordinating this Greener Together practical guide to low carbon construction alongside Dipti. And this is an opportunity for me to leave the stage to Dipti and introduce Dave in today's session.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining. And I know Dave doesn't need too much of an introduction, but here I go. So he's the director at AECOM, and he's been specializing in sustainability and regenerative design for more than 2 to 3 decades. And he's the author of Building Revolutions, the Handbook of Circular Economy, and his new book, Regenerative by Design. And he's going to be summarizing a lot of the book and also how he's been an active part of the ecosystem and trying to help with regenerative design and projects that he's worked on. So with that, I'd like to know how our audience is a part of understanding regenerative design. So I'm just gonna share my screen. Do you see my screen?
Yeah, all good.
So if you all can take your phones out and scan the QR code on the left top corner and please answer the question, then we'd know how our audience is engaging today. Scan it. Scan it from... Okay, that's a mix of people. I know about it theoretically, never done it practically. Okay, interesting. That's gaining the most. Okay, we have a great mix of people in the audience today. Going to the next question. What comes in mind when you hear the word regenerative design? It's a word cloud, so if you can type in a word, it will come up on the screen. Okay, wow. Giving new life to an existing building. Okay. Oh, that's nice. With that, I'm gonna pass it on to Dave.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you for that. Thanks, DP. Okay. Thanks everyone for being here this evening. Thanks for inviting me. I'll just put my slides up. Yeah. So as DP was saying, I've been working I've been doing sustainability for 30 years really, and only the last couple of years I've been doing some research into regenerative design. So it was a very interesting idea and concept, and have put together a book about it. And so I just really want to share some of what I found out in my research really, and talking to lots of designers and experts in the area. So today I was just going to talk a little bit about what I think and what I've interpreted as regenerative design. I agree with all your points about what it entails, and many things. It covers a lot of issues. And then I to set out the design principles that I've come up with, and then go through some case studies, examples that illustrate those design principles. And then we'll finish off and have some questions from everyone. So really, this is for me. This is I thought really interesting that looking out the window of Aldgate Tower, where I work on the top floor there, looking across the city and seeing that there's actually very little nature especially in the center of our cities, there's very little dedicated. There's a couple of trees down the bottom there, and that's about it. And I think that does a couple of things. One, it's really disconnected us from nature and natural systems, but it also means that it's a sort of dead zone really for those natural systems and for any ecosystems. And I think that's really a really key issue for us as humans, or one of many species on the planet, and not least of which is that we are completely dependent on the ecosystem, and a thriving ecosystem for our very existence, for our every bit of food, morsel of food that we eat, and every mouthful of fresh water, and most pressingly every breath of fresh air that comes from the cyanobacteria in the oceans, and the beautiful forests and other flora and fauna on the land. So this is just so critical that we look after this, and we understand that we are just one part of the ecosystem and completely dependent on it. And I think, although our cities, actually our cities are very efficient, and our towns and cities are very efficient ways of accommodating a lot of people in a very small, relatively small footprint, if you look at it globally. But what we often don't think about is the huge shadow that our towns and cities cast, and our buildings alone, cast on the rest of the planet. And these are some examples of that where you've got all of that electricity infrastructure needed to power our buildings, and of course we just take that for granted that we can plug in. And have low carbon grid and all the rest. Again, same with our water system. That both the upstream aspect of it, where we're collecting and distributing and cleaning up huge volumes of water, fresh water, to then pour flush half of it down the toilets. And then at the other end, we've got all the sewage treatment and everything, which, as we know, in the news, and certainly in the UK, is not working very well. And we're ending up using the rivers as part of the sewage system, which is just a really bad idea. And then something I've been talking about a lot previously is all the mining and activities we need to make our buildings, and to fire up the construction industry with concrete and iron ore for steel, and bauxite for aluminium, and all the rest, and sand. I mean, the amount of sand that we need for our buildings is incredible. And then lastly, just I saw this documentary a couple of years ago talking about Almeria and the acres of sort of city of polytunnels, basically, where a lot of our food is grown, some of which is then flown, and the rest is shipped over to the UK. And then, I don't know about you, but a lot of the time, you take it for granted, and sits there in your fridge for a week or two, and then you end up chucking half of it away because you've it's gone rotten or whatever. And it's just this huge waste, and the whole sort of system is this sort of global system that we're using. And what that's done, as a lot of you will know, that that's kicked us over the safe operating space. Like, I love this diagram from Stockholm Resilience Centres, looking at where the safe operating space is, and how much we've transgressed those limits in so many ways. And I won't go through all of them, but down the bottom there, you've got the phosphorus and the nitrates, that is all the sewage stuff, and all of the fertilizers that we're putting into the ground, and other farming practices that are escaping into the environment and unbalancing everything. And then the other one there, novel entities, is if you've got a cup of tea here, and if you're having a drink now, you'll be taking in microplastics, which then are getting into our bloodstream and being found in all parts of our body, and novel entities and forever chemicals that are getting distributed across the whole planet, even to very pristine areas that we thought were safe from these things. So we've got some real challenges, really. And I think I really like this diagram from Bill Reed, which I know has been replicated many times, of Regenesis Group, who were basically sort of proposing that we need to change what we're doing. And I can say I've been, for the last 30 years, I've been at this end of the scale, where I've been trying to make things a bit less bad, really, to make our buildings a bit less bad. Trying to be a bit more sustainable, a bit greener. But all we've been really doing is making, using a bit less energy, using a bit less water, using a bit less material, and generating a bit less waste. But actually, I think that, where we are in the climate and biodiversity crisis now is showing that it's just not enough. We're going to have to do a lot more to the built environment if we're going to actually sort of do anything to mitigate some of the worst impacts of the climate crisis. And so, moving through this curve up through at least to net zero, and hopefully moving to a point where we're starting to actually restore the ecosystem and regenerate it, and be regenerative. And for me, that's what it's really all about. And it's this idea that the built environment becomes an active part of the ecosystem, and then it actually starts to help restore and regenerate systems. And I know that sounds crazy, but I want to go through some examples of what that could mean. And so what I did is I just made a diagram that was trying to really just summarize the principles of the book, which this one builds up in a couple of stages. But the first step really is this idea that most of us, and certainly the projects I work on, we're focused on the site and the site boundary and the red line boundary, and that's really where most of the effort and thought goes into a project. But actually, of course, inevitably that site is nested within the locality and the neighborhood. It's nested within the city and the region. Ultimately, everything is nested within the ecosystem and the planet. And then at the on the very outside of that, I probably should have put this as a red line around the outside, but ultimately we are then bound by the planetary limits, which I was showing in that diagram earlier. And then once you look at that, all the different scales, and then I think all of these design principles then cross through those different scales, particularly this idea of systems thinking, which I'll explain a little bit more in a minute. But I think this idea around understanding the site and being rooted in place was coming out again and again in the research I did. This idea of understanding the pre-development site, what it was like when it was a greenfield site, and then using that to establish what we're trying to achieve in the built environment. So I'll go through all of these now, but that's the overall sort of overarching principles. So I think the first one I had a couple of revelations when I was doing the work, and I think one of them was around this idea around ecosystem services, and it's something that my colleagues in AECOM, particularly in our natural capital team and in our ecosystem services team, are talking about all the time on infrastructure projects. Largely, they work with large water companies and all that sort of thing, but it's not a term that is used or ever really comes up in building projects, in my experience, and it's something I think is really useful and important to start to bring into what we're doing in buildings, and that's something that I've been trying to do. And what it means really is the ecosystem services are the things that the ecosystem does to sustain and life on Earth, and us, but other life as well. And these are some of the examples of what it does. And there's a great academic and researcher called Maybright Pedersen-Zari she's looked at all of these ideas and then come down to these ecosystem services as those that are most replicable in the built environment. So everything from habitat provision through to the regulation of hydrological flows, that's keeping and retaining and restoring water, as this pond is doing, as opposed to what we do typically in built environment, which is let's get rid of any water that comes out of the sky as rainwater is treated almost as a pollutant to be got rid of. Let's get it away from our buildings and away from our towns and cities and get it down the drains and out. But actually, to seem just completely contradictory to what natural systems are doing, but also contradictory to what regenerative approach can take. And similarly with the biochemical cycles, all the things that we learned in, I did O levels, but others have done in GCSE biology or whatever, about the nitrogen cycle, the carbon cycle, and everything, and how that all works and how much we're disrupting that. And can we start to then actually enhance that rather than disrupting it? And the same with things like nutrient cycling. I mean, it's interesting. It picks up soil as an example, and it's never mentioned. Things soil is just never mentioned in BREEAM, in LEED, in any of those criteria, and it's not something that ever comes up as a topic for sustainable buildings. But actually, just completely critical to life. And what we do is we just scrape it off our site and get rid of it. Whereas actually, we could be starting to bring it into what we're doing. And of course, climate regulation is the other one, and the others are pretty self-explanatory. But climate regulation about maintaining some of the level of climate that we've thrived in for the last few hundred years of our civilization. And actually, you can. What's interesting, I think, is that you can actually quantify these. I know some people are saying, well, we don't think we need to quantify this stuff, but I think it's quite useful to be able to say, okay, these are the ecosystem services that this site or a reference site up the road could have provided when it was a greenfield site. And then those can be our starting point as targets. So we can start to say, we want to get to flood regulation of this level, biodiversity, this level, air quality. Those sorts of things can actually start to be quantified and used as targets. And, a case study that I found, and I know this is of a scale that most people, and financially of a scale that most people are not working to, but it's just a really interesting project, which is the Bayview HQ for Google in San Francisco Bay. Amazing building. Anyway, just the design is just completely radically different, designed by Heatherwick and Big. But what I like as well was really interesting was that they were in a salt marsh. So the area up the bay there is salt marsh. And one thing they were told early on is any water runoff that was falling from, onto the hard standing cannot be going onto the salt marsh. It has to stay within the site boundary, because any fresh water contaminating the salt marsh will make it, will dilute it and ruin this very precious habitat. So what they did is they said, look, let's take that as part of our commitment, and they've also got commitments from in the Living Building Challenge, and they've kept all the water on site. And they've got these retention ponds, which you see in this diagram, and this one, and this building here, the square one, is the water treatment works, which actually treats all the grey water and the black water and composts that as well. And then the grey water is recycled for use in the toilets, and it's continually recycled and then topped up with the water in the retention every so often as it loses a little bit. So they are actually non-potable water. In terms of non-potable water, they are net positive. So they actually have more water, although non-potable, than they need, and they can actually then export that to neighbouring sites for car washing or whatever it is that they might be doing that they could use it for. It also generates all of the around 40% of its energy. So all of these are photovoltaic cells. Every single tile is a photovoltaic cell, and then they're doing all these other things as well in terms of, by creating this natural habitat around the buildings. It's good for the people. It's regulating the climate, purifying air, water, and soil, and all those other things that I mentioned there. So obviously not saying that we're aspiring to this scale of project, but there's lots of interesting ideas to show that it is possible. And then I think that was the first revelation, was this idea around ecosystem services and looking at that as an idea and getting to know the site and understand what we could be doing there. And I think the second one was this idea of designing within environmental budgets. And what I mean by that is, how much solar radiation is falling on the site, how much energy can we generate on the site, and saying that is our limit. That's all the energy that we're going to use for the year. And similarly with water, how much rainwater falls on the site. Obviously, it doesn't work in every country in the world, but where we've got reasonable levels of rainwater, we say this is our budget, and we're going to design to within that. And actually, that's what this building, which I think is a really great case study and much more relatable city scale, city project that's within a constrained site and all the rest, has achieved. And this is a developer-led project. There's a whole book about it, by the way, which is a good read. And in Portland, and what they've done is they've done exactly that. So they said that how much can we generate from the roof. They also have funded a school up the road put PV on that to be able to give them enough to get a budget that was achievable for the building. And then they designed all the energy performance to fit within that with some very, very clever design, and both engineering and architecturally. And the same with the water. So they've got a rainwater, grey water, and a black water system in the building. And they've done lots of materials and all sorts of other things as well. So these are the PVs on the panel. Interestingly, they went east-west facing actually, which I thought was interesting. So you get more panels on the roof, but it doesn't generate any more from just a south-facing one, but it does get more panels on. And then this is these are the composting bins. So this is a vacuum flush toilet system, which uses just a couple of teaspoons of water per flush rather than the usual 4 to 6 litres. So massive, massive reduction in water use. And you just think, why aren't we doing this everywhere? Interesting as well, it's a great health and well-being thing as well, because when we flush the loo, normally there's about a 2-metre radius of all of that contaminated water that becomes aerosol and floats around the toilets, whereas vacuum flush will just take it all away. And then they, as I say, they treat the grey water, but then they also then compost the black water. And what they learned from another building, there was another building called the Bullitt Centre in Seattle, which was the first kind of city office building really that was Living Building Challenge compliant, certified. They learned from that, and what they found was that most people would go to the first stall in the row of toilets, and one composting bin would get very full and the others would all be empty. And what they've learned is then they've created a system that distributes all the feces down the way, so that they don't get one composting bin that fills up all the time. The other really interesting thing I thought they've done is that they capture the phosphorus and the nitrates from the grey water, which of course urine has got all of these nutrients in them, and that's then turned into a fertilizer, which they then sell. So they reckon they get about $50,000 a year revenue from that, from the waste basically. And I think what's great about that is not only are they meaning that doesn't go down into the sewage system that then requires further treatment and then potentially, certainly in the UK, contaminates our rivers, but also it means that we're not having to mine phosphates and capture fixed nitrogen out of the air to turn into fertilizer, which we then spread on our land. So actually, if you look at it from a wider systems perspective, it's doing lots of really clever things to really make lots of small local loops rather than creating these massive loops where there's lots of leakage and wastage and damage to the ecosystem through mining and things. And really that brings me nicely on to sort of what we do about systems thinking. That's really what the systems thinking idea is about, is looking upstream of our projects and then downstream of them and saying, look, can we just take away some of these impacts that we're having? And another example, and one I use in my book more about, is focusing on food and all these polytunnels. This project in Barcelona, or University of Barcelona, has an integrated rooftop greenhouse, and that's something I saw quite a lot of in my research in the States, for example. They're doing quite a lot of rooftop gardens and growing crops and food for community gardens and things, which fits with one of the cloud word cloud comments earlier about community and things as well, and bringing all that together. And this project didn't just architecturally integrate the greenhouse in, but they've also actually so that's a picture of the crops, but as you can see from some of the ventilation system, what they've done is actually integrated the heating, ventilating, air conditioning system into the building as well, or integrated it all in together. So actually what they do is they take the humid, warm, CO2 laden air out of the labs and the offices, and that goes into the greenhouse space, which of course is perfect for the plants. And also that then the plants reoxygenate, clean up the air, and that some of that can be put back into the offices and lab spaces. And also it's capturing heat in the heating season. So it's actually capturing solar energy, which then also goes into the spaces, and then it's used to go the other way. So you're getting a sort of symbiotic relationship between the two things. And of course, again, looking at this from a wider systems thinking, we're not only we're making, growing and creating food where it's being consumed and eaten, so you get fresh food, everyone knows where it's coming from, you can control it, and then you're not having all of that flights and the transport impacts of that, but also you're not having the impacts of the energy required to heat those greenhouses and all the water in often very water restricted areas. So I think it's a really interesting idea, and one that I think we should be exploring more around urban farming, coming back to those ideas. I mean, there's a pub just up the road from my office in Aldgate that actually grows quite a lot of food for the lunches it serves on the roof, the Culpeper. So, it is possible. So that's systems thinking, and that's all, all part of what we're doing really. And then the one that a few people mentioned around circular economy. Absolutely, circular economy is very much part of regenerative design, and even mentioned in the definition of it. But this idea, I think, in terms of regenerative design, I think this idea of reclaiming existing buildings and reusing existing buildings is a priority number one, which we all know about now. And what I was writing back in 2016 in my previous book, and was getting told this is never going to happen, Dave. But fantastically it has. There's been a massive policy shift. But it's also about looking at local resources, what is available locally on the site or locally that can be used. And these buildings in the Green School in South Africa does a lot of these things really well. Reclaiming buildings that used some elements of rammed earth where they could, although they were building in the pandemic, which caused some problems. They used some reed and mud ceilings, sort of traditional ceilings, lime plaster, and they went around and salvaged lots of materials as well, and components of the buildings from other buildings that were being taken down in nearby towns. So some really interesting ideas there, and I think on a very much more sort of developer-led scale, this was an interesting concept, I think, which was using earth blocks. So Bennett's associate architects were looking at what was coming out of the excavation works on this project in King's Cross in London, and so hang on, some really decent London clay coming out of this site, and it's all going to be taken away, and it's going to cost money to dispose of it. So they said, why don't we try and use this in the building rather than it becoming a waste that has to be paid for, but also wasted. So actually, what they did is they worked with the structural engineers, with the Environment Agency and various other stakeholders to test and create bricks that were earth bricks. That they could actually use in the building. Admittedly, they're not being used in any major structural purpose. They're being used to line the basement, which would have had to be lined with some bricks anyway. So they're using earth bricks as opposed to concrete blocks. So using considerably less embodied carbon in the process. And what I thought was really interesting as well is that architects spent a lot of time convincing people that this could be done, and had to work very hard to do that, to convince firstly the client that this was a good thing to do, showing the actual wider benefits of doing it in terms of waste versus resources and cost. That the structural engineer had to be convinced, and they had to do lots of testing to make sure that it worked. But lastly, I thought was interesting as well is that the Environment Agency was said, well, no, you can't do that because you just basically opened a quarry in King's Cross, which would be an unlicensed quarry. So they had to have a long negotiation with the Environment Agency to say, well, hang on, if we use all this on the site, then can we do it? And they said, okay, yeah, that makes sense. As long as it's used on the site, then it's okay. So I think, in scale from, this previous example of whole buildings being designed around that through to just some ideas around individual bits and parts of buildings. And then, this idea of bio-inspired design, I think, is something that's so close to everyone's hearts when it comes to regenerative design, is very much of what it's about, and is one of the solutions. And there's lots of examples of biomimicry around, and I think the key message is really this idea of biomimicry should be about imitating the function of natural systems and nature, not just we're not for regenerative design. We're not looking for a building or part of a building that looks like nature, but something that actually functions as a natural system. And I think that's really important to differentiation. This is slightly different. This isn't really biomimicry. This is bioutilization, I suppose, is the proper phrase for this. So actually, this is actually microbial fuel cells, and you can just see on the right there what a little schematic of it is. What it's basically doing is taking grey water, and it does also process black water. It goes into the microbial fuel cell. The bacteria in there basically use that as a food, so they feed on that as part of their metabolism, as part of this process and clever things they do with anodes and cathodes and all sorts of stuff. It generates a little bit of electricity. So it's not only taking and cleaning up wastewater, it's also generating renewable energy as part of that. And this is just a picture of it being, it was trialed in Glastonbury for 3 years in a row, and they used it to light the toilets just as a demonstrator. And then they've also done a further demonstration project in Uganda, on a school in Uganda, where they've actually taken the microbial fuel cells, they've stacked them up, and they've used them in a girls' school to light the external toilets. So it lights them, but it also cleans up the wastewater to a point where it can be returned to safely to the ecosystem, because it actually even attacks the human pathogens in the wastewater, because the bacteria see it as a competitor, so they attack them and denature them. And then it says it lights the toilets at night, makes it safer for them. And the researcher here says that Yanis says that actually what he thinks they've got to a point, or they're getting to a point, where you could make a unit that was about the size of a domestic fridge that could fit in your house, and it would clean up all the wastewater for a house, and generate some energy for you as well off the back of it. So it's not something you can buy yet, but you can see the potential for how we can use natural systems. I think the other key one around that is microalgae facades, and some really interesting books around that, which I reference, which looking at. There's a couple of practical examples around the world, but I think there's lots of opportunities there as well. And then the last one, really, just to talk about, is around design for the green and blue infrastructure, which again is pretty straightforward in terms of what it means and what it's looking for. And this is something that my colleagues in China, in Shanghai, have been doing some work, a lot of work on, actually, because, as you may know, China has a national policy around sponge cities, is the expression they've used, which is this idea of turning typically impermeable cities and townscapes into permeable spaces like this, that basically can act more like sponges. They're at huge risk of flooding in lots of low-lying cities along the Yangtze River, which are actually very, very prone to flooding. So they've actually implemented these ideas. So they've actually set aside land and turned it into these beautiful naturescapes. And you just would start to think, should we be doing this in our towns and cities as well, to start to alleviate some of the most dangerous impacts in terms of flooding, particularly. And then, of course, this, as well as creating back habitat, this also it cleans up it cleans up the water, cleans the air, and everything else like that. So really, that was a sort of quick run through all of the design principles. It was really hard to find a project that was doing everything, because this is very early days, and what what this is asking for is so extreme compared to where we are now. But there was one project that did tick quite a lot of boxes, and I thought was very intriguing and interesting. The Skoogskip project in Amsterdam. And I was lucky that I had an event here a couple of years ago, which was right beside it, so I was able to have a good look around as well, have a good look from the shore. You know, obviously go onto people's houses, but actually, what this has done, this was a community-led project where they didn't have a developer. They got together and said, look, you know, we really want to build some houses for ourselves that are affordable in a city that has very little space and very expensive land, but also very, very front of mind from what people were saying there is of course that it is sea level rises. So when you're living in Amsterdam, you know, it's something that is right there as a priority issue. So they were inspired to create a floating community. And not only is it doing that, but it's also doing lots of other clever things. So this is this gangway here that they've created that links up all the buildings is in what they're calling a smart gangway, basically, and does lots of stuff around particularly sharing energy. So they have a microgrid for this whole development. So they become both consumers and producers, so prosumers as they called them. So they're sharing the energy between the buildings. So some buildings have a lot of photovoltaics on them, some have very little and have green instead. But they share that between themselves before it goes exported to the grid, or they import from the grid. So they're balancing that all out. And then they've actually created a new mechanism called an aggregator that then, or new for the Netherlands anyway, they've created this aggregator who is an organization that sits between the community and the utility provider. And that model, now it's been set up, is actually being replicated on other projects in Amsterdam. And I think this is one of the really interesting messages about, you know, these little these one-off case studies that you think it's just so extreme. But actually what it does is it demonstrates what can be done and that this is possible, that someone has to take these first steps. But it also establishes some of the really key mechanisms for how we make this stuff happen by setting up things like aggregators. And for example, earlier in the PAE Living building, they actually managed to get agreement to turn the rainwater to treat it to potable water standards and use it as drinking water. And normally, if you try and even suggest that to a local water authority, they'd say, no chance, you've got to go with the mains water. So they managed to negotiate that on the basis that they got every surface that the water touched licensed by the local water authority, inspected and licensed, and then they agreed to it. So, you know, there are ways to break through these seeming barriers that are there. So they also do lots with water on this site. They take the heat out of the river. They capture rainwater, and they've got very efficient water use fittings. They did lots of really clever things with the materials, reclaimed materials and biogenic materials and all sorts of things. So, and of course they put in lots of space for wading birds and waterfowl and things. So lots of really interesting things, really interesting community space as well, and, you know, and a vibrant community. So that's it really. I just given you may know of these, but there's a few resources that I found. I thought the regenerative design primer is fantastic from Architects Declare. There's for structural engineers, or well, everyone actually. There's a whole book that a couple of guys have written, which is, I think, really interesting and talks a lot about systems change and how we pull the right levers to change systems. And on the back of that, you know, the Regenerative Architectural Index, which is now open for people to apply this year as well, is this idea of very clever of saying, look, instead of the Sterling Prize or architects' practices particularly being rewarded for the elements that we normally look for when we look at Sterling Prize, this is all rewarding people and practices who have taken a regenerative approach to their practice and their projects. And I think it's starting to have an impact. Certainly, I saw the other day there was a request for proposals or tenders or whatever for a project that you could only apply if you were on this index, which is just one little tentative step in the right direction, hopefully. And of course, there's the book that I've written, and I just want to leave you with this idea that, I think, this is what we're all about, that we are just another species on the planet, and we are completely symbiotically integrated with the ecosystem. And if we get this right, the great change we can make is to start to make the built environment part of an active part of the ecosystem. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Dave, for your communication. We have a few questions already in the chat.
Sure.
And I would start from those questions that, of course, they was asked during your chat. I will ask the people who type the question to ask the question themselves, turning on their camera if they wish. Would be nicer. I mean, the first one is Emmanuel Willis. Emmanuel, would you like to ask a question?
Hello, everybody.
Hi.
I'm Manuel.
The question I have is, are there any living building challenge compliant buildings outside of the United States?
Yeah, actually, there are. They have got a good list on their website with lots of case studies. The one that I mentioned, the Green School South Africa, that is, I think that's fully Living Building Challenge certified. And there's other projects definitely around the world. They've also got other, you can just do a couple of the petals, or one petal at a time. They've also got their net zero certification, and I know that I think there's two projects in the UK that have touched this. One is a visitor centre, which I'm afraid I can't remember the name of. And then the Google HQ in King's Cross actually has net zero certification under the ILFI, International Living Futures Institute.
Thank you for your question. The next one is Leon, which I see already come around. Please, Leon.
Hi. Yeah, thank you. It was a great talk. Thank you. What do you think are the main barriers to regenerative design being more widely adopted by the industry?
Yeah, it's a question I'm asked all the time, and I think it's. I always say, well, I could have written a book about the barriers, but it wouldn't be very interesting or inspiring. But yeah, I mean, I think we know the barriers, don't we? I mean, they're all around us and huge on everyday projects. It's net to gross floor area, it's yield on site, it's density, it's of development, it's it's making it stack up financially. That the barriers are just endless, aren't they? I think it really. I think that's why I've started to get quite interested in sort of systems thinking and also systemic change and some of the ideas of Donella Meadows, the late Donella Meadows. I don't know if you've read some of her papers, but there's a really good paper there about how you change the system. And I just written about it on LinkedIn actually, and given a few examples on my LinkedIn page about things that we could maybe do to change the system away from the idea of just squeezing as much money out the site as we can and ignoring everything else and ignoring all the upstream and downstream impacts. And I think the regenerative architectural index is one example of that, where we can start to make get people to start changing the way they're doing things. But the strongest lever that Donella talks about is or the most powerful lever is the changing the mindset behind the system and what creates it. So I think is really interesting. And the other one is the goals, changing the goals of the system. So it's really looking at our system as construction industry and saying, what can we do? How can we change these things and make things different? And I think things like the PAE Living Building is a great case study, because it's a developer-led project in a city, and it's multi-story. If you look at most Living Building Challenge projects, anything regenerative, it's single-story kind of in the woods kind of thing, which is relatively easy to get to be net positive in energy use and that sort of thing. So, and I think some of the thing they did were very clever. Was I think there was 2 or 3 different mechanisms they used. One was that funding mechanisms. One is that they had an open book policy with the design team and the project team, and actually gave them the project team donated some of their time for free on the basis that they would get revenue from the building in operation. So they actually got a share in the project. They managed to evaluate how much additional rent they would get, rental value they would get because of all the super green stuff they were doing and how good that was going to be for the productivity and the well-being of the people and the benefit it was going to have from a brand perspective. So actually they managed to get additional revenue from that, and that's one of the tipping things that is important. And lastly, they were they found a place where there was grants available to develop in that area. So actually they got some money towards that as well. So all of those things together start to actually tip the balance towards dealing with some of those barriers.
Yeah, I think with that is then the knowledge of people as well. It's very much a change of mindset. So education, I think, is fundamental. But yeah, just to be able to get a shift in mindset. We talked about systems thinking, but yeah, just that shift in mindset of how we approach things is quite important to instill early on. I think to start shifting the mindset of professionals, future professionals particularly, to really so it becomes more commonplace or second nature to think regeneratively.
I completely agree, and I think I've learned an awful lot in my research, and what's come out very strongly for me is that understanding of natural systems, which as I say, I hadn't really looked at since I was at school. To get into that more and understand how we were disrupting things and how do we replicate that in the built environment. And I think getting ecologists or getting architects and engineers to understand ecology and ecosystems is part of that, and that's that is a massive issue for us all to understand that.
Yeah, thank you.
Great, thanks.
We have another question by Viola. It's not a proper question. She would like to know about the reference that you just mentioned. Well, just mentioned 3 minutes ago, more or less. Viola, would you like to tell us a bit more about that? Which mention are you discussing? I think it's, I don't know what, it was just the book you were mentioning.
Which book? Sorry, I can't remember which book. Oh, is it Don Ella Meadows, you mean? Don Ella Meadows is one. I'll type that in.
Yeah.
She's also written a paper. Yeah, that'll do. Yeah, thank you. There's a free to if you just do a search for her, there's a free paper that her website has that is a good summary of that whole thing.
Good. Many thanks. Any question from the audience?
I have a question.
Oh no, that's going to be hard.
No. So I was thinking, yeah, in the lines of the first question on the living building challenge, is that the only sort of way to measure regenerative design, or like put a metric to it?
That's a really good question, actually. Yeah, I didn't really mention that. I mean, it's living building challenge is it's very useful because it's a established tool that's third party certified and it does lots of really good things. And I think it talks about being net positive energy, net positive water. But no, absolutely no. It is just one of the ways of looking at it. And I think it also has. I'm quite a fan of it, but it has actually got a bit heavier weight more recently as it seems to have grown. It was very, very simple and very clear early on, which was basically just be net positive and everything, energy, water, biodiversity, everything. And now it's started to gain more criteria and stuff, which is seems to be just what happens with BREEAM and LEED and all these other things. But no, you don't. I mean, you don't have to do any certification method. And I think what I was saying earlier, for me, it's about this idea of getting rid of that shadow of that we cast at when we have we create our built environment. And so it's if we can be net positive in energy and water and everything else that we can think of, work within the environmental limits and budgets on the site, that's a good measure. And then I think if we can start to measure and enhance the ecosystem services that are would have been there if the site was a greenfield site, then I think those would both be very good measures of whether we are doing a good job in terms of regenerative design.
Right. So what's like, let's say I was talking about this to a client or developer, and if I were to say, if they ask me what is the incentive for me to do this, like, I mean, I can say there are ample, but like financially, or like usually the questions is on finances, right? So
yeah, it's really hard, isn't it? Because I mean, when I was talking about circular economy, you could put quite a good business case together about reducing waste, reducing raw materials and reduce and that sort of thing. I think it's much more difficult with regenerative design because a lot of the design principles and ideas take up more space in the building. They mean that you might be limited in the height of the buildings and all these sorts of things that you can do. So I think the business case is so much more difficult, which is why I found the PAE living building so interesting, that they'd managed to get a developer-led project off the ground and viable with a 10% internal rate of return. That's pretty good. So I think it's really hard to sell, and I think it's more that it's about we can explain it and we can look at focusing on clients who are wanting to move in that direction. And I think that's the best way to do this is leave behind the ones that aren't interested and focus on the ones that have decided to move in that direction. We're talking to one major developer who's doing a project up in Manchester, and they're they've created the first new park in Manchester for 100 years, and they've released the river Medlock, I think it is, from its culverted state. They have put loads of biodiversity in and stuff, and then they're going to start building the buildings in the later phases around the park, and then hopefully incorporating some regenerative design principles into that. So there's a starting little inklings of movements even from a pretty commercial developer. So I think it's really showing the health and well-being benefits and the benefits to the longer term strategy for some of these projects where they're hopefully future-proofing themselves and appealing to an audience who are becoming more and more climate and biodiversity aware. What a deep issue we're in.
Yeah.
Thank you. The next question from Alex, but before Alex, I have a kind of question which will bridge deeply to Alex. So Alex, sorry, 2 seconds. Dave, I think it's interesting the fact that at the beginning, you said at the beginning, we're gonna set the goal as the site was a greenfield, going back to what was before that. And you pointed out as well that it's much more easy that a small scale building, like a couple of stories, 1-story building, would achieve a better, let's say, result at the end. And of course, we know that when we set targets and goals, doesn't mean we will get to there, but we tend to get to that point. How much of these, so setting target as it was a greenfield building, will work in a city? Because a site in a city is likely that hasn't been greenfield for the last centuries. I mean, does it work in city? How you can set the target?
No, it's a very good point, and this is something we're trying to figure out at the moment. I mean, these are all sort of ideas that have been put forward by various people, and we're trying now. It's one thing to hear the theory, isn't it, and the vision, and the next thing is to figure out how you actually do it. But I think that what Maybright, the researcher, was saying was suggesting was that you could use a reference site. So it wouldn't necessarily be your site, but you could say, okay, we think this is probably, Wildland Clay or whatever, or and so there's a site up the road that is outside of the city boundary that was doing that sort of thing. So I'm not too worried about precisely getting there, but it's more just that trying to set something a bit more solid in the brief rather than just make it a bit better, please, or make it regenerative. Let's take it down a few layers to actually setting something that we can actually measure ideally and relate to.
Yeah, thanks. This question that lead to the question of Alex. Alex, you want to ask the first question, which is
yeah.
okay.
Sure. And like following up, I guess, of just not just the local environment, would you say that the local vernacular and regenerative design also go hand in hand or are like related? Because like, for example, your example on the PA community, that was community led, not
Yeah.
developer led.
Oh yeah, no, absolutely. I think you're absolutely right. It's a great question. I think, this, what we've been doing, isn't it? We've been doing the sort of international architecture where we take, the same sort of idea, the same materials and plonk them down wherever in the world and just engineer them to work. But actually, that I think you're right. I think we've got to go back to this idea. Well, not back to, I think we've got to go forward to an idea where we're actually starting to be, the thing that came, the expression that came up again and again in my research was rooted in place. This idea that you understand the watershed, you understand the local vernacular, you understand what resources are available to you on that site for free. What can you get out of the heat? Can you get out or dump into the ground? What's water's available? What materials are locally used and available that you could use and repurpose? So no, I think you're absolutely right. I think it's very, very, very much hand in hand.
Alex, please ask the next question, Alex.
Yeah. And like also, how do you think, like, as you were working on sustainability, how do you think the movements such as like the passive house movement can be incorporated into regenerative design? And like, what about newer movements such as like, I think the active house movement that I've heard?
Mm-hmm. No, I think it's all part and parcel of it, really. And I think it's all about really just making sure it fits within the overall philosophy. And I think something like passive house is, if you look at what I was saying back to the PA or any of the buildings where they've said, look, our budget for the energy use is what we can generate on site. That really sharpens the mind, because then you say, well, okay, I can only so there's lots of different ways of hitting that budget. You've got to do everything right. You've got to get the design absolutely brilliant, but you've also got to make sure the operation works, and you've got to make sure the occupiers are all on board as well. So all of those three things have to be beautifully coordinated to make that work. So passive house is definitely one way to really drive down that energy demand to a level where you can actually generate enough on site. But you've also got to be thinking about how that works with the operators and the occupants. So, I know people have been having all these debates around, do we seal up the building or do we let it, have openable? People I speak to who are enlightened around passive house are saying that of course you have openable windows, that's fine. You just, you make sure that it's sealed when the windows are closed, and then you can open the windows and then you create an environment where people want to be. There's a lovely case study called the Enterprise Centre you might have seen in University of East Anglia, which is passive house, but it's also almost entirely biogenic materials. So it's a timber structure, a couple of stories high. It's got the most striking feature is the facade rain screen is made from reed thatch, because it's in East Anglia, and of course that's thatch is the local material, and they've used that as part of the not just as the rain screen cladding to protect the building, but also it helps with the insulation, and it looks really cool, I think, as well. And I tell you what, it really smells nice in the building. We don't have that, do we? That doesn't seem to come into any brief that I've seen. Can we have the building that really smells nice? And I noticed it in project in Amsterdam called Park 2020. There's a couple of buildings there where they've got rid of it's all cradle to cradle certified materials. They've got no nasty chemicals in there at all, and the building just smells great. And the Enterprise Centre just smells just wonderful. Definitely recommend it, even just to have a sniff.
Thank you, Alex, and thank you, Dave. The next question is from Viola. Viola, would you like to ask your question?
Hi. Can you hear me?
Yeah, perfect.
Hi. Yeah, I would kind of read it actually, because what I understood from previous answers is that regenerative design is quite difficult in urban areas. It's rather, as you also repeated later, easier in isolated cases, let's say. So how significant is the impact that it can have then realistically? So what is the kind of fine balance between aiming for regenerative design on one side, and the importance of density and avoidance of urban sprawl. So in this sense, reconnecting to the questions from another person, are the barriers really education based or only education based, or rather based on pragmatical matters? And I'm saying this actually as a supporter of regenerative designs. I've done a few training schools about it, but I still wonder this point actually.
No, absolutely, yeah, and that I've tried to pull out some case studies that were, in cities, and I think if you look at something like the Spun City, thing that they've actually just gritted their teeth and said, look, actually, that land on that I was showing you, and it's prime development land, with a high value, but they said no, it's more important that we actually turn this into permeable space, because we just won't have a city otherwise. It will be underwater. So I think that, and I one of my images, I don't know, did I put it on the front? I think the first image I had was actually of our I got our let me show you. Oh, no, I didn't have it. Sorry, no, I don't got it. I had to put a different front cover on. But I got an image created by our graphic design team to show the Fleet River exposed outside of in central London, because it's completely culverted. And I thought, wouldn't that be great if we could uncover, because it used to be a navigable river, the Fleet River. It used to, and it runs down Farringdon Street, I think it is, down into the river there, underground now. And you think, this is the sort of thing we're going to have to do if we, and imagine how that would look if we had open rivers in our cities. In terms of your question about is it balancing? Yeah, it is balancing, I suppose. But I mean, we of course we don't want urban sprawl. But I mean, I live in West London, and just near me is there's loads of office buildings all the way down the M4 corridor. GlaxoSmithKline have just vacated this massive office space. It's sitting there, massive site sitting there empty. We just got to rethink this stuff. That's got to become. So we shouldn't be leaving sites vacant. The high density sites that then pushes us out into greenfield. That's crazy. We've got to look at how the system works and change the system.
I wonder if then is a matter of basically policy. So once it becomes in a way mandatory, because the interest of the city, the whole city or the whole neighborhoods is more important than the profit in a way. And I feel that this is only pushed if policy is changed towards that. Otherwise, if it's up to individual clients wanting to do the right thing, I feel that this process may take a long time.
Absolutely, but it's look how far we've come with circular economy. When I was writing my book in 2016, no one knew what circular economy was. People saying, Dave, what are you writing about? I had no idea what you're talking about. 2017, it went into the draft London plan by luck, and it's turned into a whole, everyone knows what it is pretty much now. Every project team meeting I go into, they know, at least nod when I talk about it. We've got to do some fast change, and I think if we wait for policy, it's not going to happen. But I use the case study or the example of the smoking ban in the UK. No government was going to put that in until there was enough public support for it that they weren't going to lose all the votes and lose the next election on the back of it. The public mood shifted sufficiently. There was enough people agreed with the idea of stopping smoking in public spaces that actually they were happy to do it. So I think we've got to keep pushing from our side to lobby, but we've also got to build stuff, because I get asked all the time is, what's the new innovative thing, Dave, that we could be doing on this project? And I go, oh, is this, and I've got a whole load of stuff. And they go, oh yeah, but when has it been done before? I go, well, that's the point. You asked me some innovative stuff, but you're too scared to do it. Someone's got to go for it, and actually, like I was saying earlier, we've got to break through those mechanisms. We've got to do the research offline to work out what we can be, so we know what we're talking about when we go into that project meeting, when there's a fixed deadline and there's and saying, well, why don't we do this? I've done the research on it, all the certificates in place. We know what we know what the issues are, we know what the cost uplift or the implications are, we know the lead-in times. Bang, here we go, let's do it.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
Yeah, before moving into Alex, I was going back to the question, and I see that Leon had another one, had a second question. So, Leon, if you want to ask the question, and then we give the floor to Alex.
Yeah. Do you think the next iteration of the UN's SDGs should be more regenerative in focus, like RDGs, should we say?
Yes, I'm sure they should be. I don't think I'm in any position to influence that. Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. I think, I'm trying to work at a level of kind of, setting out a vision for what I think we could be doing in the built environment and on projects that we're working on. I haven't been able to influence the UN, I'm afraid. But yeah, absolutely. But it's all. I mean, really, you could argue that the sustainability agenda as set out, in the Brundtland definition was actually kind of a regenerative definition, really. I mean, but it's just been diluted and it's kind of lost its way, certainly in the built environment over time, hasn't it? It was the idea of meeting the needs of the present generations without compromising the needs of future generations. Bang! That's just great, isn't it? That's exactly what we're trying to do. But when it gets reduced to a list of things that you could do in a project and you tick a few boxes and you get a certificate at the end of it, it's lost that original concept and it's just turned into less bad.
Indeed. Yeah.
Thank you, Leon. Alex, please.
And like going back to like the innovations in technology, on the other hand, what about like trying to retrofit existing buildings, especially for like listed ones where you're not really able to make as many changes? Can you still incorporate regenerative design?
Yeah, no, definitely you can. There's lots to say about that. I mean, I think it is a real issue. You're right, a real problem. But actually, looking at particularly non-domestic buildings, that they're much in terms of energy use, for example, which is probably the main issue. The particularly with listing is that you can't really touch the fabric is a lot of the energy impacts are from the building services, and you can usually find ways to replace those, and then you can intervene often or can intervene in things like roof insulation and things like air permeability. You can really tighten up the leakage level of the building. You might be able to replace windows. So there's things that you can do, and actually they still have a big impact. And I think I tried to look at the examples that I gave were really, although they're all new build, they all have things that it's all retrofittable. You can put biosolar roofs onto existing buildings. You can radically reduce the energy demand. You can put in grey water, black water treatment systems. You can put microbial fuel cells and microalgae facades. You can do all, there's all this stuff that we can be doing. And I think one of the key things here is, and I didn't say this earlier, was around this isn't just about nature-based solutions, because in our cities we're not going to always be able to get nature in, but it is so we will have to be doing biomimicry, we'll have to be doing bioutilisation and other technology-based solutions as well. And I don't have a problem with that. I think that's fine, and that's a way to, as long as it's mimicking natural systems and trying to replicate those.
Thank you, Alex. Thank you, Dave. Any other question from the audience? If there are no more questions, we'll call back Dipti.
Thank you all for engaging so well into the conversation. Before we come to an end, I'm going to share my screen again to have another poll. Do you see my screen?
Yes.
So if you can all scan the QR code again and let us know what your key takeaways from this session are, that would be great. That's an interesting set of answers. Do you have anything to say, Dave?
No, I think that's brilliant. I think I love that. Visit the BAE building. Yeah, actually, there's an event coming up in May. There's the International Living Future Institute has a conference in May in Seattle, and they have part of that is a visit to the BAE Living building.
Are you attending it?
Enterprise. No, I'm not going to fly, and I don't. Yeah, I decided not to.
Nice. Okay, let's stop sharing. Thank you all. Luigi, do you have any final words?
Well, thank you to Dave first to accepting this invitation and giving us another incredible communication about insight of how to approach a complex theme that, as we've discussed today, is not just about regenerative, it's not just about passive house, it's not about using natural materials. Let's say, talking about a few of the lecture that we had in this session, but it's about putting everything together, understanding that all these action, all these approaches could live in the same project, is about being aware, being open and understanding the assessment of what was before, what was when it was a greenfield, what is going to be during the operation of the building, the reconstruction, and the life cycle are key to get to net zero. I would like to thank everyone attended today and everyone attended the sixth event. As I told you, this communication will be published soon on St Albans Greener Together website. We are doing a bit of editing, and you will have the opportunity going back to the sixth lecture later. Thank you again, everyone. And I will see you probably in the next event we are going to organize, maybe next year. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Deepti, for coordinating this with me. You've been brilliant, as all the speaker. David's here, just representing the sixth speaker. I would like to thank you, all of you, to share with us, with the wider community, because online, the good things is sad we are not at the same place, but on the other side, we know that being online allow much more people and a wider community to access this knowledge. Thank you, everyone.